Thank you so much for the warm welcome, and thank you especially for joining us this morning. I enjoyed the first presentation so much, and most of all, I want to thank the whole Western team for the lovely book. Not only is it informative, but lovely, down-to-earth usable. So a big round of applause for everybody involved in this. And I'm glad it's on the record. I'm very pleased to have been a co-author of a couple of the chapters, and it very well supplements the Master Gardener Handbook. People open it up and they see color, they see what we call adoptables, meaning information going back to the soil, things that they can implement in their own backyards and share with others. So with that, for the next 50 minutes, I'm going to do a quick snapshot of sustainable landscaping. And does everybody have the handout that accompanies that? All right. I have raise your hand if you don't have it. Okay, Rosa will get some more. I also, at the end of my presentation, I have the websites and the links that you can download and print that. All right. The definition that I most use, that I think is most valuable for sustainability, is meeting the needs of today's population without diminishing the ability of future populations to meet their needs. So I think that that's the starting gun here, so we're all on the same page with that definition. Why garden sustainably? It's a good question. There's three main reasons, and most people do want to save money, but they also don't consider that the primary reason, and that's a good thing. Improving garden health and protecting water quality and wildlife are two premier reasons. And the beauty of sustainability in gardening is that you accomplish not only those tasks, but by doing so, you do save money. So it's a real hand-in-glove scenario. I like to look at it as leaving a greener footprint for our children's children. There's 6 elements that I'll do a green light touch and go on, and there's more information both in your SoCal yard transformation book and the handout that you either have or before you leave will have. The first one we'll talk about is really important. It's incorporating plants suitable for climate and microclimate. So let's talk about that a little bit. And as far as the Master Gardeners, this is a bit of a refresher, and I appreciate you bearing with me while we go back to the nuts and bolts, the basics. Selecting plants recommended for your sunset zone. All right, does everybody know what their sunset zone is? I have a couple slides, don't worry. And microclimate. We'll talk about the difference between the general climate and the microclimate. How many of you have heard of USDA zones? Great. How many of you originally are from the Northeast, Upper Midwest, or somewhere like that with a cold climate? USDA zones are perfect for those climates. The reason is the bottom line is the last predicted frost date. It's not so important here in Riverside, right? But it is for the past agrarian culture and farming population. So there's certainly a place in history for USDA zones, and those of you in colder climates in California, the Master Gardeners in the mountains, USDA zones are great up there, but for the bulk of you, anybody from the mountains that lives there now here? All right. So for the bulk of you, we're looking at Riverside County sunset zones of 18 and 19 for the valley cities. Those are important numbers for you to remember. 13 out in Coachella Valley. The reason that these the zones are more important are that they're smaller and they're just more accurate, much more accurate than the large USDA Zone 9. So a lot of people, besides knowing the links to Bob Perry, who will be here next week's website, that's searchable and specifically for inland SoCal plants, where you can search based on the larger climate, your microclimate, color of flowers you might want. In my world of arboriculture, woody plants, it would be the ultimate size needed to support a mature tree, both above and below ground. So that's a great resource, and he'll be covering that and going through that extensively next week. So I hope I'm not disappointing you, but my talk today only has a couple example plants, and it's more about the concepts of sustainable landscaping because Bob will be discussing specific plants next week. Oh, I'm sorry, next month. They're not every Saturday. I knew he was the next speaker. Sorry about that. Thanks for the correction. They can dub that out of our movie. They can correct it. All right. So this is something, as far as my talk goes, that I'm happy to have posted. I'm happy to email it to anyone that might want to share it with their HOA or garden club, and all these websites are clickable. So Cal Poly Pomona has worked with many other organizations and has something called Select Tree. And that's an excellent website by which you can select by about 8 criteria, resources for the perfect tree, right plant, right place. And then there's the Sunset Western Garden Collection, the California Native Plant Society, and then this last one, which is a really weird name, WUCLS. WUCLS is the Water Use Classification of Landscape Species. My friend and colleague, Dr. Dave Fugino up at Davis, took over the project after Dr. Larry Costello retired a few years ago. And this is used widely by designers and architects that are linking into the water budget that we all have throughout California. So the searchable database covers very low, medium, and high water using plants. And many architects are required to use WUCLS during their design phasing. That wasn't the original purpose of it, but that's one thing that has come of it. And I just wanted you to be aware that WUCLS is available and searchable as well. And then next month, Bob Perry will talk about his Inland Valley garden site that's very searchable and useful. Just an example, if you searched for a tree that's not going to tangle with your above ground power lines, that's going to have prolific flowers, that's going to be receptive to pollinators, and also is fast growing, a lot of the acacia species will pop up on all of these websites. So this is an example of what you could find when you search. Smaller shrubs, there's even more available species. There's hundreds of them. An example is the grevillea. This is the Canberra Jim. When you see a name like Canberra Jim, that means that it was selected and it's a trademark cultivated variety. And in this case, it was selected and bred because of its very bright red flowers in the spring. So take a look at some of these if you're only familiar with the parentage. You might be surprised at what's come out of the breeding programs. And then the Fremontodendrons, beautiful. You can tell I like yellow flowers. I just realized that 2 out of 3 of my examples are yellow flowers. But this is one that was also improved and has a lot of flowers, fast growing. With that, let me throw a wrench into this. What if I would have added to that search another criteria? Messiness. Whoops. Say goodbye to that one and that one. So it's all about the specific use, location, and maintenance level that whether it's you or if you're a master gardener, the person that you're advising needs, wants, and has a desire for. So to each his or her own, and this gives you 8 criteria by which to search to find that perfect plant. When we talk about microclimates, a big one are what we call urban heat islands. We all have them. Think asphalt, think re-radiated solar radiation, think high temperatures. This is near my house in Palm Springs. This tree is growing very, very well throughout the summers there. It's been there 25, 30 years in a shopping center parking lot. I went out there on a day that was about 118 to 20 degrees, and I measured at a 90-degree angle the temperature of the heat re-radiating off of the asphalt. Anyone other than a master gardener, because you're going to know this, want to guess what the temperature was? The temperature from the re-radiated heat. It's going to be quite a bit above the 119. Close. It was over 140. And some of these trees actually endure conditions in the Coachella Valley of 160 during certain peak times during the summer. In Riverside, we've done the same thing and measured the heat index, and these trees are enduring 120, sometimes 130 degrees. Last summer was a bear for all of us, but at least we could go inside in the air conditioning. These guys can't. What we found are these trees actually require about twice the amount of water when they're subject to these conditions as if they were more in a park or an open forest setting. So that's important to remember as well. Other microclimates would be shady areas, not enough root space to support a very large growing tree. Think ficus. Beautiful lollipop trees requiring 2,500 to 3,000 cubic feet of root space. That's a lot. We're going to come back to that later. Poor soil. We consider that a microclimate issue. So microclimates are smaller areas around your home that greatly impact the success or lack of your plants that you're hoping to select. Right plant, right place. So you start with your zone 18 for a lot of you, and then when you're searching these indices, you're going to skinny down, drill down based on the criteria for your site. Besides conserving water by selecting the plant that's going to do well for you, we need to hydrozone, and that's simply placing plants with similar water needs in the same irrigation zone, so that via valves, you're irrigating on the same schedule. You're applying the same gallonage of water on the same days. So here's a couple examples of hydrozone landscapes. And certainly turf, if you're still interested in having a lawn, try to convert it from cool to warm season. You'll save about 30% of the water. But you can separately hydrozone that. And then the bulk of your landscape, of course, you'd want to plant with very low and low water using plants. And also think about, if you're done with your lawn, think about converting it to an area where you could have vegetables or fruit trees. They, by square footage, take about the same amount of water as turf. So would you rather have kids and dogs playing on it, or would you rather eat it? So that's the choices that you have. Edibles or turf, those are both high water using plants. So here's an example of low, medium, and high water use hydrozones. And again, most food crops are considered high. Some water districts give you a freebie and don't put you up in a higher rung for growing edibles, but you need to check specifically with your district. So you can see the top left one, what we consider the new California landscape, that would be very low and low water using. The one on the bottom left is actually on average a medium one, and the one on the right, as you see it, would be medium to high. So if you'd like to have a few comparisons, the high water using zones use about as much water as cool season grass. Who knows a variety of cool season grass? What's that? Bluegrass. That's right. Bluegrass is one. What else? Fescue. Most of the tract homes, especially those built in the 80s and 90s, had front, side, sometimes backyards with fescue. That's the traditional tract landscape lawn. What else? Ryegrass, annual and perennial rye. So when you see the overseeding of Bermuda grass in the fall, Bermuda grass is a warm season grass, which is much more water conserving than fescues, but they overseed with annual or perennial fescue. So that's the difference in watering during the winter or just letting the warm season grass, as we say, go fallow. Brown is the new green, right? I promise I don't have too many graphs. I took a lot of them out. And this is one, though, that is near and dear to my heart, and I never will take this graph out. For one thing, it's always an eye-opener to me every time I see it. So I leave Palm Springs in it, even for my Valley students, as I like to call you, because of the difference. So I hope you see that just because of the riverside climate, you're going a long way to not waste water in your landscapes, no matter what you're doing, just because the evapotranspiration rate here is only about 2/3 of what it is in the desert. So in Palm Springs, where I live, it's about 6 feet of water a year that through evaporation from the soil and evaporation from plants, which we call what, Master Gardeners? Transpiration, right. So that water loss is about 6 feet a year. One thing in Coachella Valley that I think would be critical if the goal is really to cut down on water waste would be to require pool owners to cover up their pools. There's 6 feet of water, one pool for every 2.5 residents of Coachella Valley. Be a good idea, wouldn't it? In our landscape, you can see, though, that in Riverside, you have about 57 or 58 inches of water that's lost through evapotranspiration a year. And the best opportunity to conserve water is going out of summer and into fall. Look at the drop. These graphs show the relative amount of water that your plants need from season to season. So many times we have vacations in the summer, we're in the mode of doing a lot of landscaping, and then in the fall we go indoors. Remember to dial back greatly how much water you're applying to your landscape. You can see that the need really, really drops down. The other thing is to know your soil type. We always call dirt soil. I know it sounds kind of funky, but since intro to horticulture class I took way back in the 70s, I learned never to say dirt again. I was told dirt is a 4-letter word, and I thought, that's weird, so is soil. Oh well. So it's important, if you look at the graph, the picture on the right, if you're watering a space that's mostly sandy, your water is going to not only infiltrate much faster than if you have some clay in the soil, but it's also a much thinner profile. So when we're drip irrigating our plants, if you have a loamy soil, then it's going to be an average of those two. So if you're using compost, it's perfect because it has the virtues of sand, which drains well, but it also has the virtues of a more clayey soil, which holds more water. That's the beauty of compost or a loamy soil. So it's important when you look at the soils coming out of those pots to emulate the middle type of soil. A dark soil smells good. It could be compost or it could be a garden soil that you just happen to have inherited when you bought your home, or maybe something from a box store even. But the more you can compost and recycle at home, the better for the environment. The other thing that I wanted to make sure that you didn't worry too much about is having an expensive probe or implement, or like the irometers, the tensiometers, to measure the bars of pressure. You can simply use a trowel, a straightened out metal coat hanger. Anything that can penetrate through the soil will help you gauge how deeply that water is going every time that you irrigate. I know it's harder and harder to find those old coat hangers, but I've got a couple in my closet. I open them out, go out in the backyard, and when you can't push them in readily anymore, then you're at the point where the water is stopped and you're at dry soil. So that's a real good indicator of helping you schedule irrigations well, and also making sure that the time between each irrigation is right. For trees, we'd love that coat hanger to go down a couple feet. How many of you think you could do that in your backyard right now? I couldn't. So for trees, you want to make sure that you're allowing their genetics to be exhibited, and as pronounced as possible, pull those roots down to the genetic potential of those trees. So you always want to water an inch or two below the current root zone to be able to pull those roots down. The roots will go to the water. The water won't go to the roots. So you'll want to find out where those roots are and pull them down. For grass, 6 to 8 inches is fine. And you don't have a 1 to 2 ton blade of grass. I always think of that movie, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. When our daughter was young and I took her to it, I thought that would be like a tree limb that could be 2 tons failing and falling on somebody in our real world. So trees that don't root deep enough are much more prone to failure, and limbs or the whole tree falling over. That's why you want to draw the roots down. With grass, not so important unless you're the star of the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids show. That could hurt then. The other thing that we advocate is something called the field test. That helps you determine when the soil is at about medium capacity to drain and hold water, is in the middle. So if you take a ball of soil and it's not just spurting water, nor is it so granular that if it's sandy, it just comes apart in your hand. If you can retain somewhat like a sponge amount of water in there, then wait a few days and it's time to water again. That's almost perfect 50% soil moisture capacity, as we say in master gardening training. This is another really important tip that I'd like to share with you. Most established plants, like the picture of the tree on the right, are actually over-irrigated. And recently established trees, like on the left, are under-irrigated. Why do you think that is? What's the difference between the water needs of those? The root structure, that's right. What about it?
Well, it's much diminished.
When you're transplanting a 15-gallon tree that you're bringing home from the nursery, the roots are pretty confined into that area that they were growing in the pot. And so you don't want to start watering outward too quickly or downward too quickly. But you're going to need to water in some cases every day for a little while, which is against all the recommendations that you hear for us for established landscapes. The tree that's established on the right probably will do well with one really deep spring irrigation and then a couple in the summer if push came to shove. So you can see that they have entirely different schedule requirements. That's the talking point from that slide. The picture on the left is a hole that was destined for a 15-gallon tree. 48 hours later, it still is full of water. Not a great place for that tree. So this is something simple you can do, and you're gonna get the idea just in digging that hole that it's not suitable for a tree. But we also don't wanna dig a small hole and put great soil such as compost in there unless we make a huge hole, because of what? What will happen? The roots are gonna keep circling. So if you add compost to a tree planting hole, make it 10 times as wide. You see in our publications, plant at the same depth and then 2 to 3 times wider. If you're gonna be using compost, 10 times wider, so you don't worry about the circling roots. Practical tree irrigation principles are, as the tree grows up and out, irrigate further outward from the trunk. The trunk should never become wet when you're irrigating. I know in a lot of cases it does, but you want to water to the drip line and beyond. It's really important to be able to move. If you're using a hose, it's easy because you just go out there manually and you water in that drip zone. But if you have a drip system, you're going to need to move those emitters out as the tree expands with its roots and top growth. Other things that make a difference in the landscape as far as water use are the density of the overall landscape. In general, the more plants, the more dense it is, the more water it requires. Here's an example of low-density landscapes requiring less water than denser ones. Mulch, mulch, mulch. You're going to hear that so many times. Excuse me. Excuse me, my allergies from all those acacias are getting to me. Keep in mind that mulch is important, but it's also important to place it away from a tree trunk. We're going to come back to that when we're talking about best practices in IPM, so keep that in mind. If you have singly spaced specimen plants, think about converting to a drip system. Sprinklers are great for turf and ground covers. It's a cropping situation, but drip is really best for your ornamentals. It's a great way to reduce soil evaporation and keep weeds out because you're not watering the big area between the plants that you just as soon have nothing grow at all but have mulch over it. This is out by my house in Palm Springs. We had 80-mile-an-hour winds about 6 months ago. Remember that period? It was windy here too. This was a tree at the development across the street off of Sunrise and Mesquite. And the turf and the tree, being that they prefer completely different water schedules, aren't compatible. When you had those gale force winds coming through, it was literally like a carpet of grass that was picked up. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's a pipe. And the tree was solely watered via the turf irrigation system very shallowly, causing, in the intense winds, the tree to fall right over. You don't need 70 or 80-mile-an-hour winds to have this happen. It can happen with almost no winds at a certain point when the tree just gets too big and it doesn't have the support. Here's some examples of incompatibility irrigation-wise. You want to irrigate outward, keep water away from the trunk. This is something that we see over and over again, having broken sprinkler heads, sunken heads, non-vertical heads, wrong spacing, wrong pressure. That wastes far more water on average than the grass itself. So it's not just the cool season turf being the bad guy, it's the sprinklers watering sidewalks, watering everything but the grass. With that said, can lawns be part of a sustainable landscape? Sure. No, no, and no, though. Why no, no, and no? What's wrong with the top picture? Runoff. It's almost important and essential when you're irrigating turf to use sprinkler systems. We don't have good subterranean systems, which would be great, but we just quite aren't there scientifically. Technologically we are, but it's not working real well in the real world. We're still getting a lot of leaks and pipes, and we can't see what's going on. So all this water's running off, and with that, any fertilizer and any pesticides that are applied run off too, and that makes our water system more prone to pollution. So the bottom left, the same thing. The bottom right, just why? It's a lot of maintenance, and you're gonna go in there and mow that or bring goats in or something? Doesn't make sense. Another why. The lower right is to remind me to make a point about the difference between a zero, as in Z-E-R-O scape, and a xera, as in X-E-R-I scape. How many of you have heard the term X-E-R-I, xeriscape? That's a good thing, right? Zeroscape, not so much. If simply the goal was to save water in our backyards, why don't we just concrete over everything? So that's throwing out the baby with the bathwater. That's not what we're advocating. That's certainly not what we want you to do. So this is a cul-de-sac, and there's 8 homes in this cul-de-sac up in Santa Barbara. My husband and I have a place that our family had for years up there. So 3 years ago, the Cash for Grass program was very popular up there, and everybody in that cul-de-sac was impacted. 2 people did what these neighbors did, and they have a pervious layer there, and they maintained and drip irrigated that tree, which was a good thing. 2 of their neighbors just let everything go to high heaven, or the other place, which I won't say on camera, and they got notices from the county weed abatement that no, those aren't wildflowers, those are weeds. 2 of them put in artificial turf. It's come a long way, but it doesn't give us oxygen, and it never will. It doesn't take in carbon dioxide and help purify the air, and it never will, right? So the rest had a hybrid approach where, similar to slides I've shown you before, if they wanted edibles, they had edibles. A lot of them completely eliminated their lawn if they didn't have kids and dogs anymore. And they had a lot of mulch and very low and low landscape plants. So it does take a village. If everybody concreted over their backyard, side and front yards, it wouldn't be a good idea. We do have the lawn watering guide, and that's referenced in the book as well. We ask that you use that, because that's based on your local weather, and that'll clip off 30% of your water for your warmer, cool season grass right off the bat. Water cycling is important. Water cycling means that when you first see early runoff, water running off the top of your lawn, stop. Note how long that system ran. Let the water infiltrate and drain through the soil. Come back as close to that time as possible and water again. Does that make sense? That's different than what we call spritzing, where you water for 5 minutes and then you come back the next day and you water for another 5 minutes. When the soil's wet, you want to let it drain and then come back when it's still moist and water again. It's really an important concept. That'll help draw the roots down too. If you have a lawn and still want to maintain it, grass cycle, compost, do something so you're not ending up with a single blade of grass in a landfill. There's mulching mowers, a lot of them these days that you have. They recut 3 times each blade, and they just redeposit it back on the other grass. That's great. Or bag it, compost it. If you're no longer happy with it, think of alternatives. Okay, some other tips to conserve water. Most of us use brooms again. Dust off the old broom. None of this spraying our sidewalks anymore. Weeds compete with landscape plants for water. Nothing fun about weeding, but think about your water bill, and then it gets more exciting because you'll save a lot of water. We talked about using a soil amendment such as compost. Think about that. If you have a tree site, remember what we talked about, add a lot. Otherwise, for shrubs and for vegetables and other small garden annuals and perennials, then compost is the way to go, and you don't have to worry about 2 tons of branch falling down. Capture the water. Apply mulch. Mulch conserves water, it beautifies landscapes, does about 10 other things I didn't list, keeps weeds out, keeps tree trunks dry, don't over-fertilize. Another aspect of sustainable landscapes are preventing and reducing pest problems. How many of you have heard of IPM, Integrated Pest Management? Okay. Who wants to share the nutshell definition of IPM? I know the master gardeners know it. Anybody? You'll be recorded, you'll be famous. You can even come up here and say, anyone want to come up here and hello? No. It's using a variety of means to control, not necessarily prevent, but control pests and keep them at an acceptable level using chemical means as a last alternative. So when we're talking about best practices for irrigating trees as they grow outward at the drip line, keeping their trunks dry, all these things, those are actually a big part of IPM. And I wanted to make sure that we connected those dots. It encourages beneficial insects and microbes, and if the term that we used to use in the landscape industry was spray and pray. And that simply meant, gee, I see a problem, I don't know if it's insect or disease, I've got some insecticide in my back 40, and I have a lot of fungicide, so I'm gonna blast it with both. We know these days not to do that. We've come a long way, not only with the industry, but with homeowner kinds of education. Master gardeners know this like the back of their hand. You know it, but I'm saying it again just as a reminder that when we're talking about polluting groundwater and that potential, then some of that comes from the spray and pray. And also, just the population of the good guy microbes goes way down if they're being killed off. So there's very, very good reasons to always identify the problem before you decide what to do about it. Maybe you don't need to do anything about it. Maybe when the weather turns, it'll take care of it. Attract and protect your beneficial partners. No bugs, no birds. This is an important triangle, and again, I'm trying to keep the visuals to a minimum that look too scientific, but this is another thing that I think you can remember as a take-home message of my presentation. To have a disease, you have to have 3 parts, 3 sides of this triangle, or any kind of disease-producing organism will not produce the disease. We could go out here, we could accumulate samples throughout this landscape at Western. I could take it over to my friends at UCR Plant Pathology and Entomology. They'd come up with a laundry list this long, particularly of plant pathogens. But they're not going to take hold unless you have a susceptible host, meaning a plant. The plant, if it's resistant to that particular disease-causing organism, the disease-causing organism can be there in high populations and never impact that plant. And you have to have a favorable environment for that disease. So one thing you can do is right plant, right place. There's a bunch of crepe myrtles out there now that are resistant to powdery mildew. So remember back to your grandmother or mother that had beautiful crepe myrtles, but they looked ugly half the year. There's a lot of new cultivars, cultivated varieties now that don't get powdery mildew. That's just one example. So you have the best chance of having a resistant host to the disease and favoring the environment for your landscape and your vegetable and your fruit trees, rather than an environment that favors the pest. So IPM stresses the use of recommended planting and maintenance practices to prevent, actually it should be to, I should take that out because I don't like prevent in there, but what it means is prevent the need for pesticides, which doesn't mean to prevent the pest per se. It means to keep it at levels below a threshold. But I just don't like to see prevent in there at all because it makes it sound like we're sterilizing everything. Certain populations are all right. So let's look at some IPM practices. They have to do with best management practices in our landscape, and they're things that are very related to IPM that you may not have thought of. And that is avoid construction damage and compaction in root zones, right plant, right place. We don't want to see this. Improper pruning. This is from the East Coast. I use my bad examples from the East Coast here, and my bad examples from here back there, so I don't necessarily have a picture of somebody's house and they're going to say, oh, that's my next door neighbor. Proper pruning means not flush cutting. You want to cut outside of that branch bark ridge, and if you make a proper cut, you're not going to notice it really. It's not going to look like a bad haircut. You see the top versus the bottom? The bottom, the branches were removed via flush cutting, which means that the bottom part that was removed actually cut right into that trunk. So you see the difference on the top? You cut outward a little bit where that branch bark ridge is. Cut outward a little bit, otherwise you're cutting into the trunk, and then that's a wound that creates a situation where you can get insects and diseases. So trees, they don't heal, but they callus. You want them to callus over like that. We want to avoid this. Walk your neighborhoods, talk to your neighbors before this happens. Some of these trees that are planted have 8 to 10 of the pieces of green tape up and down them. Get those things off. That can kill a tree. Way too much structural support. Trees need adequate space. Large growing species, as I said earlier, require 2,500 to 3,000 cubic feet of space. Not enough space. Creative, but a wrong plant, a wrong place. Encouraging wildlife. This I'm going to just mention very, very briefly. I'm not a wildlife specialist, so I'm going to refer you back to your manual that has a great chapter in there. But there are 10 tips for attracting wildlife. And one thing is limiting the amount of your lawn. If you really want to have a wide diversity of wildlife, increase vertical layering between the ground and the tree canopy. Provide water. Right water, right plant, not wasted water, but water for birds, for available water wildlife needs, not for wasting water that's going to run off into the gutter. So this is a case where native vegetation may be a good idea. Bird bathhouses and bird feeders. Get the invasives out. We have a website link that lists invasives. Some of the pampas grasses, the tree from heaven that we call the tree from something else. It's a sumac. All these plants waste a lot of water, and they're very invasive, and they're not good to attract wildlife. So you want to get rid of those. And you want to expand the scale. Work with your neighbors to expand the scale of habitat-appropriate landscapes. Conserve energy and reduce pollution. This is a short one too. Shading air conditioners while allowing winter sun to shine through is a great idea. Think west and east sides and northwest sides of your house, and think deciduous trees where they can warm your home in the winter, right? Because deciduous trees lose their leaves, so the sun can come in. Yet in the summer when they have their leaves, they can cool the house. You can save 25 to 30% of your energy indoors just by implementing some of these practices. using LED lamps outside to provide accents instead of the old-fashioned lights. A properly placed tree can reduce temperatures by 20 to 25 degrees in heat islands and reduce indoor energy consumption by 25, actually on average more like 30 to 35% if done well. Windbreaks can help divert pollution and reduce allergic reactions, and obviously the best known factor is that they reduce wind velocity. Pollution is something that's really important when we're talking about sustainable landscaping. We talked earlier about not spraying and not overly applying pesticides or fertilizers, and then watering and having all that running off and ending up in our waterways. It's really important. The other side of that coin, too, is something called carbon sequestration. Who knows what that is? You get the microphone again? Anyone want to come up to the microphone and talk about carbon sequestration? It's capturing carbon, usually in the form of carbon dioxide, which is very much of a pollution indicator. So we could have point source pollution, we can have not as much as we used to, but vehicles that we're driving that create the increase in pollutants. And trees, when they give off oxygen, they take up what? Carbon dioxide. So it's a match made in heaven. Another hand-in-glove situation there. A mature tree can capture and sequester thousands and thousands of pounds of carbon a year. A little tree, not so much, but as they age, they can capture a lot. So to review, sustainable landscapes incorporate plants suited for the climate and the microclimate, conserve water and nurture soil, prevent and reduce pest problems, encourage wildlife, conserve energy, and reduce pollution. The Sustainable Landscaping in California publication you have can be downloaded free. We also have 2 newer publications, the use of gray water in urban landscapes in California and the keeping plants alive under drought or water restrictions. If you just Google those, the name of them, and then UC for University of California, space ANR, Ag and Natural Resources, the catalog will pop up, and then you can search and type. There's hundreds of other titles as well. These are just the ones that are pertinent to sustainable landscaping. I want to thank you, and that's actually not my last slide. My last slide is that those of you that aren't master gardeners, or those that are, that just want to call with a question you can't answer and sort of modify your voice and ask a colleague master gardener to help you with the gardening situation, these are the helpline phone numbers for the desert and riverside, and they welcome pictures you might email in, as well as the old-fashioned phone call. They're there. There's a message recording that will indicate when they're in, and they'll call you back. And with that, I'll take a couple questions, and I thank you so very much.